All right, let's discuss the four remaining causes of the Great Depression. Cause number 5, stock market speculation and bank failures. In 1928 and 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, the indicator of the stock market's overall price level, more than doubled. It exploded. Money poured in, much of it on margin, meaning borrowed money. You used to buy stocks on margin. You could buy $100 worth of stock by putting only $10 down. You borrowed the rest. Margin buying seemed to make sense. Prices just kept going up. In 1928, Radio Corporation, RCA alone, soared by 400%. Money flowed indiscriminately into all kinds of risky investments. When, in October of 1929, confidence in future earnings faltered, margin creditors began demanding repayment of loans. If you're going to pay back your margin loan, the only way to do it is to sell the stock. The market spiraled downward. The market crash alone, of course, cannot explain the Depression, however. Linked to the market crash, economic historians emphasize the importance of many, and I mean many, bank failures, mostly rural. Weaknesses in the rural economy, i.e. agriculture, made local banks vulnerable. In the late 1920s, food prices plummeted, and farmers' land was overmortgaged. There was a 1919 bubble in land prices, encouraging farmers to borrow money on their land. When agricultural prices collapsed, the value of the land collapsed, and therefore the underlying value of most of rural banks' loans collapsed. City banks also suffered from structural weaknesses. First of all, they failed to keep adequate reserves, and there was no requirement for them. I'm sorry, there was a requirement. The Federal Reserve had been in existence for a decade or so, but they weren't policed very well. They also invest heavily in the stock market. They would take customers' deposits and buy stocks with it. That's now no longer legal. It's not the safest investment for depositors' money. They also made a lot of risky loans, part of which fueled overcapacity. And finally, they made loans, risky loans to Germany, Austria, Latin America. The New York banks did, and this proved to be bad when the Depression went global. Another major cause of the Great Depression was the Federal Reserve Bank itself and its lame and inadequate response to the initial crisis. They realized that their easy credit policies and their keeping the money supply high throughout the 20s was probably part of the problem, so they panicked and said, oh gosh, we've got to suck all this excess money out of the system. And so they constricted the money supply. Well, of course, it was too late to do that. That just made matters worse. Some economists point out that the Fed did, in 1932, finally buy some government bonds, which is one of the ways they inject money into the system. They brought total holdings up to $1.8 billion. But bank reserves rose only $212 million, not nearly enough because people had lost faith in banking, were hoarding cash. It was too little, too late. Once people leave the banking system, the Fed can't use the banking system to manipulate the money supply. Now, in 1936, a very famous economist, probably the most famous economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, a Brit who was ennobled later, became Lord Keynes. In 1936, he wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And he talked in this book about why conventional economic theory was flawed. It said that if consumption fell due to saving, that interest rates would fall, spurring investment. But this wasn't what happened because of the loss of faith in demand, which was extreme in the Great Depression. In other words, yeah, interest rates were super low because people weren't consuming and they were saving, but that doesn't mean that if I'm a businessman, I'm going to go build a new factory because I can borrow cheaply. The supply of money is there, but I'm not going to build a factory when there's no demand. And so Keynesian economics focuses very much on the demand side of the equation, and demand had fallen to nothing during the Great Depression. Kind of building on this sort of monetarist explanation of the money of the Great Depression. There's a guy named Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, brilliant economist, won the Nobel Prize. He argued that though the Fed did not cause the Great Depression, it failed to use policies that could have prevented a recession from becoming a Great Depression. Because, again, in 1930 and 31, the Fed tightened the money supply. Milton Friedman is essentially a libertarian. He believes government should have as few laws as possible. That's the meaning of this cartoon over here, including laws regulating the use of illegal drugs. Another great theorist, Benjamin Bernanke, he agreed with Friedman and said in 2002, quote, "Let me end my talk by abusing slightly my status as an official representative of the Federal Reserve. I would like to say to Milton and Anna, a fellow economist of Friedman, regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." Now, he was just one of the 7 governors in 2002 when he made this speech, but fascinatingly, of course, he became the chairman of the Federal Reserve just in time to see the Great Recession, and he did not make the mistake again. He dramatically expanded the money supply. This is why he was 2009's Time Man of the Year. So you thought economists were boring, but they can be like rock stars. I might point out here that not only did the Federal Reserve actually practice that they went in the wrong direction and contracted the money supply when they should have been expanding it. Fiscal policy, the other tool, did the same thing. Herbert Hoover was trying to be responsible, and he realized he was spending more money than the government was earning, so in 1931 he asked Congress for a tax increase. Of course, that sucked money out of people's pockets. That was also the exact opposite thing. So we were doing the exact opposite thing with monetary policy we should have been. We were doing the exact opposite thing with fiscal policy we should have been. Cause number 7, a very ill-advised tariff. The Tariff Act of 1930, supported by 2 men named Smoot and Hawley. Here they are. Smoot's on the right in this picture. 2 congressmen, and they said, you know what? We need to raise tariffs, lock out the foreign goods. By doing that, Americans will have to buy American goods, and so American factories can bring people back to work. It seems to make sense, but it was disastrous. It also was appealing to a lot of people because throughout the 20s, American farmers sought higher tariffs to protect themselves against foreign competition. So Smoot-Hawley raised tariffs on 75 farm products, 32 to 40%, and a similar percentage on 925 manufactured goods. Industrialists made this happen. Industry did need assistance. But of course, how do you think foreign governments reacted? Smoot-Hawley produced a tariff war. The Canadians were the first, and they're still our biggest trading partners. They were furious. They enacted their own high tariffs. Everyone else started enacting high tariffs. There was a tariff war, and foreign trade, already greatly weakened by the Depression, was devastated. So short-sighted U.S. monetary and trade policies spread the Depression worldwide. This is not so much a cause as a reaction and an exacerbation of the Great Depression. But Smoot-Hawley was disastrous, and it was realized pretty quickly, but too late. And finally, cause number 8. Post-war demographics themselves. And this is fairly... don't hear much about this, but I think it's fascinating. There was an economist, a Canadian economist named Clarence Barber, and he suggests that declines in the population growth of the U.S. and really of the Western world was a significant, if not key, factor in the Great Depression. There were huge numbers of young men killed in World War I. And so in the 20s, there are all these households that would have been created that aren't created. There was also the 1918 flu epidemic following the war, in which 3 to 6% of the world died. So there were all those people that did not become households, or were households that just went away. There was also cultural changes in the Roaring 20s. Women started wearing their dresses shorter. It kind of became okay to be single. People were having fewer children. Those were also households that didn't occur. So all these things resulted in fewer households that would have existed, all at the same time as industrial capacity is greatly expanded. So the demographics also exacerbated the problem of oversupply. So basically, the Great Depression was not caused by one thing, but was a perfect storm of things that occurred and were made worse by bad government decisions.